It happened when I was 6 years old. My grandmother and I were returning home after a long day in the city center. It had already grown dark, and heavy, dark clouds hung in the sky, promising rain. That night, the city felt different, grim and frightening. The streets were empty, and the faint light of a few street lamps barely illuminated the sidewalks. I remember my grandmother holding my hand tightly, but at one moment, when we stopped at a flower shop window, she let go for just a second. That was enough. I got distracted and walked forward, looking at the bright lights. When I realized my grandmother was no longer beside me, cold fear gripped me. I turned around but saw no one. Only an empty street, darkness, and the distant sounds of thunder. My heart pounded in my chest so hard, I thought it might leap out. The rain started suddenly, as if the sky had decided to tear open over the city. Large drops fell heavily on the ground, on the rooftops, on me. I didn't know where to go. Everything around me felt alien. I walked through unfamiliar streets, looking around in search of something familiar, but every turn only confused me more. The houses towered above me like giant, silent walls, and the light from their windows seemed distant and unreachable. My footsteps echoed faintly on the wet pavement, but suddenly another sound joined them, footsteps that matched mine. I stopped and listened, and the footsteps stopped too. Turning around, I saw no one. The street was empty, but I could feel someone watching me from the shadows. I started running. The rain poured harder, cold drops stinging my skin. My heart thundered in my chest, and my legs carried me forward on their own. The footsteps returned heavy and steady. They grew louder, closer, as if someone was right behind me. Every turn only led me deeper into a maze of narrow alleyways. Finally, I burst onto a small square, where under the dim light of an old street lamp stood a solitary bench. I stopped, breathing heavily, and looked around. A dark figure in the distance, in the shadow of one of the houses, appeared to me for just a moment. Someone was watching me, tall, in a long black coat and a hat that hid his face. He stood still, as if waiting for me to notice him. A cold fear pierced through me. I didn't know what to do. The man didn't move, but I knew that if I took another step, he would start following me again. Then he began to move. His steps were slow, deliberate, but each one echoed loudly across the wet pavement. He walked straight toward me, indifferent to the rain that was pouring from the sky in torrents. I tried to stand, but my legs felt glued to the bench. Panic paralyzed me. As he came closer, I saw that his face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, but something strange glowed beneath it, something terrifying. His eyes, or what should have been his eyes, seemed to flicker in the dark, though I couldn't make out exactly what I was seeing. He said nothing, made no sound except for those heavy footsteps, but I felt that he had come for me, that he had been waiting for me in this darkness. I jumped up from the bench and ran as fast as I could without looking back. The footsteps returned, but this time they were closer. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw his silhouette slowly moving after me. He didn't hurry, but it felt like with every turn, he was drawing nearer, no matter how fast I ran. His presence was everywhere, in the dark alleyways, in the shadows of the buildings, around every corner. I dashed onto another street, hoping to lose him, but then I heard a quiet whistle in the wind and felt cold breath right behind me. He was there, closer than ever. The footsteps had fallen silent, but I knew he was near. Finally, I heard a familiar voice, my grandmother, calling my name. I froze, not believing my ears. When I turned to look for him again, the figure was gone. Everything around me was as it had been the rain and the empty street. I ran toward the sound of my grandmother's voice, and within moments I found myself in her arms. She hugged me tightly, but I still felt the fear coursing through my body. She said nothing, just quietly led me home. At home, sitting wrapped in a blanket and listening to the rain hitting the roof, I remembered that man again. His eyes, cold and terrifying. It seemed like they were still watching me, even through the closed windows and walls. I wanted to ask my grandmother about him, but fear held me back. What if she said she hadn't seen anyone? What if it wasn't a man, but something else? Since then, I haven't seen him again, but that fear stayed with me. Sometimes, when I walk through empty streets in the rain, I feel like I can hear footsteps behind me. Heavy, steady footsteps following me.